Welcome to the on-demand presentation for North Central Texas Council of Governments Procurement Training and Best Practices, presented by your NCTCOG purchasing team. There's a lot of information to cover, so let's get started. Here we have a list of the learning objectives that will be covered in the presentation. The 5 W's is a checklist used in journalism to ensure that the first paragraph, the lead, contains all the essential points of a story. You may be familiar with these. They are who, what, when, why, and where. These are very important items that will be covered in our presentation today. We will go into detail on the who, the what, the when, and the why. As we know, COVID has taught us that the where is not always quite so important as we once thought, so we are going to replace that one with a more appropriate and even more important one for the purposes of this presentation: the how.
As you may already know, the NCTCOG is a political subdivision of the state of Texas and complies with the same provisions for purchasing goods or services that apply to local governments. NCTCOG utilizes a centralized purchasing program and a competitive procurement process to gain maximum free and open competition. This ensures purchases are obtained efficiently and economically and in compliance with the provisions of applicable federal, state, and local laws and regulations. There are many reasons why government purchasing is regulated, including to safeguard public funds and taxpayer money, to ensure responsible spending, to obtain best value for the agency, to encourage open and fair competition, and to give all vendors an equal opportunity to do business with NCTCOG. You may be wondering where all of these rules come from. The Executive Director, along with the NCTCOG Executive Board, establishes the policies, rules, and regulations for the purchase and procurement of all commodities, services, and equipment. Additionally, purchases by NCTCOG are also made in accordance with several other local, state, and federal laws, regulations, rules, policies, and guidelines that you see listed here. It is important to note that NCTCOG policies may be more stringent than the statutes required by the state, and that NCTCOG will follow its policies even if they are more stringent than the state or federal requirements.
Now that we've learned where the rules come from, let's take an initial look at the procurement thresholds that guide our processes. Government procurement processes involve different dollar thresholds that determine the level of competition and documentation required for purchases. Here's a simple snapshot explanation of the key dollar thresholds, starting at micro purchase, up to $3,000, small dollar purchase, up to $49,999, and formal purchase thresholds above $50,000. We will discuss each of these in greater detail on the upcoming slides. So now we'll take a deeper dive into each of the procurement thresholds to gain a better understanding of the processes that are followed at each level.
Micro purchases are those from $0 up to $3,000. These purchases are considered minor purchases and do not require a competitive process. P-cards may be used for these purchases. It is important to remember that all purchases must be made responsibly with price checks to ensure we are obtaining the best value for the department and the agency. Small purchases are those from $3,001 up to $49,999. Written quotes from a minimum of 3 vendors and 2 historically underutilized businesses, commonly referred to as hubs, must be requested. A contract should be awarded to the vendor with the lowest price that can satisfy all requirements for the goods or services being requested. An important note here is that if a vendor that is not the lowest price is selected, the department must provide adequate justification for best value reasoning. As a potential exception, a cooperative contract may be used in lieu of a quote request if one is available. We'll discuss cooperatives in more detail later. Formal purchases are those above $50,000. A request for proposal or RFP, invitation to bid or ITB, or request for qualifications RFSQ issued via our e-procurement platform. There is a requirement to advertise in local newspaper for 2 consecutive weeks, for a minimum of 15 days before proposals or bids are received. We also complete direct outreach to all known potential vendors to notify them of the opportunity. Due to the additional steps outlined here, departments should allow a minimum of 6 weeks for this process. Additionally, as a potential exception, we may use a cooperative contract in lieu of RFP, ITB, or RFSQ, if one is available. Formal purchases that pass the $100,000 threshold follow the same requirements as the $50,000 formal purchase threshold, with the additional requirement that these purchases must be approved by the NCTCOG Executive Board prior to contract award.
This is a snapshot of a quick reference guide that we have available for use. It covers the thresholds we have just talked about, but in a handy one-page document that you can print out and keep readily available at your desk. This guide is available on the Procurement Hub intranet page. We will include a link at the end of this presentation, but it can also be emailed to you as well, upon request. It's a very helpful guide on your first steps in making a purchase. Just to tie everything together, here are some final important notes to remember regarding dollar threshold requirements. All quotes, bids, approved cooperative pricing, and approved exemptions must be obtained prior to purchase for any dollar amount. For purchasing compliance consideration, the spend amount is determined by the total amount of related purchase or total term value of a contract, not individual invoices or requisitions. This is called cumulative spend, which is something we will discuss in detail later. Documentation of appropriate compliance method utilized must be submitted as backup for the purchase requisition. These may include quotes and a signed quote summary sheet, an executed agreement signed by vendor and executive director, a cooperative quote with the relevant cooperative contract award information, or allowable exemption documentation.
There are generally 4 stages of the procurement lifecycle. Phase 1 is the planning phase, prior to the issuance of a procurement. Phase 2 is the active procurement phase. Phase 3 is the evaluation phase, and then finally, Phase 4 is the contract management phase. Let's look at these in more detail.
During the planning phase, there are important roles for both the department and the purchasing team. The roles of the department include communicating with purchasing to determine the appropriate method of procurement, planning ahead to ensure adequate time for the desired award or contract start date goal, and to provide complete specifications and desired deliverables for solicitation document. The roles of the purchasing team include determining the appropriate method of procurement based on information provided by the department, collaborating with the department to develop an anticipated timeline for all phases of the procurement, developing a solicitation draft document to submit to the department for review and approval, and to provide guidance, support, and outstanding customer service to department throughout the process. One of the roles of the department we discussed in the previous slide is to provide a scope, or specifications, for the solicitation. This basically tells the vendors what our desired deliverables are in the goods and services that we are requesting from them. In addition to being clear, concise, and complete, these specifications must not be unduly restrictive. This means that our specifications cannot have requirements that impose unnecessary or excessive limitations or constraints that may unnecessarily narrow and limit competition by favoring certain vendors or products. Brand name is one example of this, in which case you must ask yourself, does this really matter, or is this just what I'm used to or familiar with? Additional ITMEs to consider when preparing specifications include your timeline. When do you need it? Don't wait until a contract is about to expire or the end of fiscal year to start the solicitation process. Remember that formal procurements take a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks. Will installation be required? If so, who will complete the installation? Will it be installed in-house? Is it part of this solicitation, or will we procure the installation services separately? What does implementation or onboarding entail, and how might it affect the total price? Provide specific or estimated quantities if known. Include any known requirements for warranty, support, training, or IT security verifications. These items are examples of considerations that will either affect the price, the timing, or the vendor availability to meet our needs, and this is why it's so important for our scope and specifications to be as complete and accurate as possible.
The second phase is the active procurement. As we noted in the previous section when discussing the formal purchase threshold, these solicitations have some additional steps and rules to be followed. The first is the advertisement requirement. Notice of the time and place at which the sealed responses will be publicly opened and read aloud must be published at least once a week for 2 consecutive weeks in a newspaper published in the municipality. The date of the first publication must be at least 15 days before the date set to publicly open the bids and read them aloud. While 15 days is the minimum time frame required by the state of Texas, the standard practice for NCTCOG is to have a 30-day active solicitation in order to allow as much visibility as possible, to allow time for the inquiry period, and give interested vendors an adequate and reasonable amount of time to create and submit a quality proposal for consideration. Any substantive changes or revisions to the solicitation during the time the solicitation is active will result in us issuing an addendum. This is a formal notification that the content of the solicitation has been revised. Examples of this could be extension of the proposal deadline or due date, changes to the scope of work or specifications, or changes to the anticipated contract term. These are necessary so the responses that we receive are as accurate as possible to the program desired deliverables, funding, and departmental objectives.
Now we'll continue on to the third phase, the evaluation phase. Take note that evaluations are part of the RFP or RFSQ process due to the more complex nature of the solicitation. In other words, we have a problem and are asking the respondent to tell us how they would best solve it. These projects usually have a lot of room for creativity and individualization. Evaluations are not used in an ITB, which we will discuss in the next slide. Similar to the planning phase, the evaluation phase also requires important roles for both the department and the purchasing team. The roles of the purchasing team are to complete an initial review of each submission to determine its responsiveness, to develop the evaluation tool based on the criteria outlined in the solicitation document, to provide instruction and guidance to the evaluation committee throughout this process, to calculate scoring of proposed pricing from each respondent, and to compile completed evaluations into master scoring summary for final review and award recommendation by the evaluation committee. The roles of the evaluation committee are to review each submission and provide unbiased individual scores based on criteria outlined in the solicitation document, to maintain confidentiality of all submissions received throughout the process, to complete the evaluation tool, including adding comments for any scores of a below-average rating, to provide award recommendation to the department and executive board, if applicable, for the vendor or vendors with the highest average weighted scores that provide the best value to the agency. While a sealed invitation to bid, or ITB, is a solicitation method available for formal threshold purchases, this type of solicitation is used more for standard goods or services where there is not any deviation in the specifications or desired deliverables, and price is the main consideration. It is an alternate procurement type where a vendor is selected based on bid tabulation results, and the vendor with the lowest price is generally selected if all other minimum specification requirements are met. It is important to remember that because of these characteristics of an ITB, a department must provide adequate justification for best value reasoning if selecting a vendor that is not the lowest bid price.
The fourth and final phase of a procurement is the contract management phase. All contracts resulting from an awarded procurement are managed by the purchasing team. The full contracting process has a life cycle of its own that includes many tasks. Let's take a closer look. This slide outlines the main tasks involved in the contract lifecycle that will be completed by the purchasing team and generally follow this order. First, A contract draft will be created and sent to the department for review and approval. Once approved, the contract will be sent to the vendor or vendors for signature. When the vendor has returned the signed contract, the agreement will then be submitted to the executive director for final signature. The fully executed agreement will be saved to the appropriate bid file, with a copy sent back to the department for use as backup documentation in a new requisition. Pertinent contract information will be added to a contract tracking Smartsheet database. Renewals and other amendments, if applicable, will be drafted and processed by purchasing in the same manner. Prior to the final contract expiration, the purchasing team will reach out to the end user department to determine if a new procurement should be completed. Another important item to note is that each department is responsible for tracking their overall spend as related to the contracts awarded, or not to exceed amount. While this is something purchasing will validate when change orders, renewals, or amendments are requested, this is not something we actively track.
Let's take a moment to explore some approved exemption types of alternate procurement methods and learn what this means. This slide includes a list of acceptable exemptions from the normal procurement processes and are potentially available for non-federal award purchases. Listed in order of most common to least common, generally, they are goods or services purchased through cooperative contracts, personal, professional, or planning services, as outlined in Texas Government Code 2254. Unforeseen damage to NCTCOG property, machinery, or equipment. Goods purchased for resale. Emergency purchases. And sole source purchases. As you can see, we have another important note. The use of exemptions must be validated and approved by purchasing prior to purchase.
The co-op sites listed here are resources for awarded contracts that have already gone through the procurement phases required for NCTCOG compliance and are approved for agency use for NCTCOG purchases. Other cooperatives exist and potentially may be available for use. If you find a contract outside of these listed that you are interested in pursuing, please reach out to purchasing. Our team will complete a due diligence compliance review and will submit the request to the executive board for approval. Please note the TechShare Cooperative logo there in the center screen. As you may know, this is the cooperative that was created and still hosted by NCTCOG, so if there is a contract available for use through TechShare, we certainly ask that you consider that first since it does support and benefit the agency as a whole. Finally, another possible exemption that requires further explanation is professional services. Per Texas Government Code, Chapter 2254, these are defined as services which are mainly mental or intellectual rather than physical or manual. In order to procure these types of services, we would not complete an RFP or ITB as we have discussed earlier. Rather, these services are ones that would be procured through a request for Statement of Qualifications RFSQ, where we would select a vendor based on their qualifications alone and not even ask for pricing until the top candidate was chosen. After the top candidate is selected, we then would request and negotiate pricing. This one can be a bit tricky in that while these 6 professions are specifically called out in the government code, there may be other services that can be considered professional services based on that definition, subject to procurement and legal review and approval.
So you may be wondering, why is all of this so important? The simple answer is ethics and the ethical code we all have agreed to follow. Employees of NCTCOG, as public servants, will carry out their activities in a fair and legal manner, avoiding actual or perceived conflicts of interest. All staff members are expected to conduct the activities of the agency always in full compliance with the law and in an honest, fair, and courteous manner. Violating these ethics standards acts against NCTCOG's policy, which is to treat all individuals, members, potential members, contractors, and others fairly and equitably. When thinking of our code of ethics and behaviors we want to avoid, it's helpful to start with the 4 Ps. Purchases for personal gain. Procurement with family members. Purchases for personal use and political influence. A note on procurement with family members. The requirement is that there must be more than 2 degrees of separation to not be considered a conflict of interest. The expectation surrounding political influence is covered in the HR policy and states that you are encouraged to vote and to exercise other prerogatives of citizenship consistent with state and federal law and NCTCOG policies. However, in your official capacity, you must not use your authority to influence elections or coerce political contributions, and further outlines that state or federal funds may not be used to influence legislative outcomes or for lobbying. This is a summary. The full text is available on the Internet HR Hub, if desired. If you're unsure of whether a conflict of interest may exist, please discuss with the Senior Purchasing Manager. In addition to the 4 Ps in the previous slide, we also want to be certain to avoid component, sequential, and incremental purchases as well. The first of the examples on your screen, essentially splitting purchases, is more of a violation of the rules with intention in an effort to circumvent the procurement rules. The second example of multiple purchases over time, or aggregate spend, may be something that occurs without malicious intent, but is equally as dangerous because the end result is the same: spending dollars over the respective threshold that requires additional steps or processes to be completed in order to remain in compliance. In both examples, these are practices that are strictly prohibited and, at minimum, violates policy, but depending on the amount, could also violate the local government code statutes. As you can see here, violating the government code could carry legal penalties as a Class B misdemeanor, which may be punished by a fine of up to $2,000, confinement in jail for up to 180 days, or both, the fine and confinement. In addition to the legal ramifications, violation of the HR ethics policy may also be grounds for disciplinary action, up to and including termination. This is not meant to scare you. Rather, it is important to know why we work so hard to ensure everyone is aware of the laws, rules, and expectations, so we can avoid any unfortunate consequences.
Let's recap some of the main topics of discussion and important reminders that were covered in today's presentation. NCTCOG procurement policies comply with the provisions of applicable federal, state, and local laws and regulations. NCTCOG will follow its policies even if they are more stringent than the state or federal requirements. Be mindful of procurement thresholds and applicable requirements at $3,000, $50,000, and $100,000 levels. The procurement lifecycle is a lengthy process, so it is important to plan ahead. It also requires consistent communication and collaboration between the departments and purchasing team. Remember, we are here to support you. Know the available alternate procurement methods, but make sure they are approved for use before purchase. Finally, it's important to act in an ethical manner in all procurement-related activities. If you are unsure, ask first. We covered a lot of information here, and understand that you may have some questions about one or more topics covered in the presentation. Once again, please take some time to check out the resources available on the Intranet Procurement Hub using the link here, or reach out via email, Teams, or by phone to discuss any items that you may be unsure of.
This concludes the on-demand presentation for procurement training and best practices. We appreciate your time and attention. We look forward to working with you in support of any upcoming procurement needs.